The Tom Woods Show, episode 1391.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Folks, if you enjoy the Tom Woods Show, it's time to go to the next level. And next level Tom Woods is libertyclassroom.com. This is where my friends and I teach all the stuff you did not get in your conventional education. History, economics, and more, the way it ought to be taught, with all the content they left out or distorted. Check it out at libertyclassroom.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. Yes, I know I owe you an episode with Scott Horton today. I'm out of town with three of my daughters on a sort of vacation, and the logistics just made that impossible, so we're going to be moving that episode to Friday. Tomorrow, it's going to be just me. I'm going to be talking more about some conventional anti-libertarian arguments, but some that you may not have heard good answers for before. And I'm going to be going over some pretty darn good answers with you in episode 1392. But today, what I'm going to do is share with you an interview from, if you can believe it, all the way back in 2011, before one of the three girls who's with me was even born. And this is an interview I did, I think the third time I appeared on an outstanding program called Financial Sense News Hour. And I was talking about my relatively, at that time, recent book, Rollback. And we talk about everything under the sun relating to government and spending and the budget. But it goes well beyond that, as you can see from the description of this episode. So I think you're going to enjoy this one. And I'm speaking to not a completely mainstream, not like a CNN audience, but there were plenty of mainstream listeners who listened into Financial Sense News Hour. So I'm dropping rhetorical bombs left and right on these people in the course of this interview. So it's a lot of fun in that respect. So here we go. Hope you enjoy it.
Joining us on the program in FSN In Depth this week is Thomas Woods, Jr. He's author of a new book called Rollback, Repealing Big Government Before the Coming Fiscal Collapse. You know, Tom, last week I had John Williams on the program, and we went through the government's 2010 income statement. And what is amazing is you go through this, 80% of the government's budget, entitlements, defense, and interest is considered untouchable. And in Washington, they're arguing over $4 billion or $6 billion worth of budget cuts, or $60 billion, with money being spent of this magnitude when the government, I think the budget deficit this year is going to be $1.7 trillion. Is it too late?
Well, if we're going to stick with this attitude, then it absolutely is. I just saw a poll the other day in which a majority of Americans were saying that Social Security and Medicare payments should be increased. Now, I mean, that's just, I don't know what kind of la-la land these people are in. But Social Security and Medicare are already in the hole $114 trillion. Is that not enough for these people? So, yeah, if that's the mentality we're going to have, then there is no hope. I mean, the only chance that we've got is for people to, for us not to act like 7-year-olds, for us to have some knowledge of what it is we're facing, and to face it like adults, not like children.
You know, it was interesting, Tom. I can remember after the November elections, and everybody was excited. The Republicans had taken the House and one of the biggest turnovers in Congress since '38. But what I find remarkable, which reflects back on what you just said, in public opinion polls done by the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, basically the gist of those polls were, cut spending, but don't cut mine. Raise somebody else's taxes. Don't raise mine. And in your book, Rollback, you talk about most of the people reading this book will live through one of the most significant periods of change in American history. The scale of the coming inevitable spending cuts will be unlike anything Americans have ever experienced during peacetime. Americans have never seen federal spending scaled back. Even when the newspapers speak of budget cuts, they don't actually mean the budget will be lower than it was the previous year. They mean only that its rate of growth is following. So between now and the entitlement collapse, you talk about what our politicians will likely try to do is buy time. We'll have some kind of marginal reforms, but when that time runs out and that day is coming, they will try the same thing again. With default staring them in the face, they will try tax increases, they will try borrowing, they will try printing money as the Fed is doing now. You believe none of these approaches are going to work. Why is that?
Well, apart from the moral issue involved with all those approaches, which makes them all off the table in my book, there are also practical considerations. I mean, for example, it seems that there are people in this country, a lot of them, who seem to think there is no problem that taxes couldn't solve. If it weren't just for these absolutists who oppose all tax increases, why, we'd solve this problem in a jiffy. Well, the tricky part of that is there's a stubborn statistic that most people are unaware of that Jeff Hummel, who's a professor out on the West Coast, dug up, and it's this, that ever since the Korean War, no matter what the actual marginal tax rates have been, the actual tax bite that the federal government has been able to confiscate from the public has more or less hovered around 20% of GDP, and only very, very rarely has it gotten slightly above that. But basically, that's as much as they've gotten, and that is quite an interesting statistic, that, you know, tax rates go up, tax rates go down, and yet the tax take hovers around the same amount of percent of GDP. So it's like this is some kind of built-in limit. So if they're thinking that somehow we'll just seize more property from the people and solve it that way, just on practical grounds, that's going to run into problems. And of course, in terms of borrowing, well, you're running into practical brick walls there, not simply because foreign lenders may begin to lose confidence in the U.S. government, which indeed they will likely do and indeed should, but the fact is a lot of the countries that would lend to us are themselves going to be facing pretty substantial problems in the coming years. Japan is already going through a wrenching demographic change in its country, a very rapid aging of the population. China, with its one-child policy, is going to be reaping the fruits of that. They're going to need a lot of their money at home. They're not so much going to be interested in parking it in 0% return, the lending to the U.S. So that's inevitably going to start to dry up. And then finally, printing the money, I think, refutes itself. It's the only remaining possibility, other than actually cutting things, is the sort of old supply side notion that we'll grow our way out of the problem. Well, this is a problem that I don't see any plausible way you're going to grow your way out of it. You would have to have the repeal of pretty much everything, or to drop all taxes. I mean, I don't know how you would grow your way out of a problem this size. So that's basically where we are. There is the traditional approaches that they have used for years and years and years are going to fail simultaneously. But they're going to try all three of them at once. We can be sure of that.
In order to stop the government spending juggernaut, you talk about we need to expose the myths of government is acting on the behalf of the public good. I think all you need to do is just take a look at the stimulus package as a payoff to special interest groups to, maybe put one of those into the forefront of, or spotlight, how very little was accomplished with it. But, there is this feeling in the media when something happens, like you get an economic downturn, the guys on Wall Street, the media people immediately say, well, government needs to do something to fix it, to get us out. We still have the bulk of Americans believing, Tom, that the government can somehow fix things rather than what they're actually doing is making it worse.
Well, this, Jim, is really the key to rollback, which is, I think, of all the titles of mine, I intended this to be the most blow-your-mind sort of book, because it's the kind of thing you hand to a Tea Party guy, and it looks like an anti-Obama book, and he'll be comfortable with it. Sure, it's against Obama, but with each chapter, it gets more and more daring in its conclusions, and it's basically arguing this. It's not primarily a book on the budget. It's primarily basically saying what you just said, which is that it would be nice to cut the budget, and I'm all in favor of that, but much more important is to cut the propaganda that leads us to have these big budgets in the first place, that to cut out this way of thinking that we were all initiated into when we were in the 6th grade, and we all know this by heart, what we were taught in 6th grade, that government is composed of wonderful, self-sacrificing public servants pursuing the common good, and why without them, think of where we'd be. I mean, we'd have no art or science. Everybody would be an ignorant boob. We'd probably all be doing a rain dance somewhere. We'd all be having our limbs blown off because our computer monitors would be exploding, or we'd all be working in a mine for $1 a day. Every single one of us listening to this, we all got this, and I know that it is superficially plausible, but pretty much what I'm doing with Rollback is arguing that given that we're going to have to make wrenching changes anyway, we're going to have to roll this thing back anyway, we're going to have to cut anyway, we might as well embrace this as an opportunity. This is not a calamity to be deplored, because the various causes on behalf of which the government has racked up all these debts have not in fact helped us. They were not necessary. The myths on which they were handed to us are laughable, and the free market itself has a far better record when it comes to eradicating poverty, providing for consumer safety, providing for sound money, and so on and on down the line, providing for scientific research. It has a much better record than government has. So this is where we need to be, is believing that we as a free people could in fact provide all these things that we're told we couldn't ever have if it weren't for Joe Biden watching over us all. I don't buy that, and I don't think Americans should buy it.
Now, just to put this in perspective, how big this problem is, and this is something that just really struck me when I looked at the government's budget last year. We've been doing this every year in the program. Now, everybody hears about the debt ceiling over $14 trillion. Unfortunately, that's only part of the picture. There's another additional amount that's $111 trillion. I don't even know if people know how big that number is. And even by the own reports published by the Congressional Budget Office, by the year 2020, and Tom, this assumes no major increase in interest rates, the U.S. will be spending close to $1 trillion a year on interest alone. But these budget deficits, as big as they are, don't, I guess, reflect the impending problems of unfunded Social Security and Medicare. And as you pointed out, they want to increase that even more. And even a Democrat such as Lawrence Kodlikoff, an economist at Boston University, he said that the fiscal gap is an astonishing $200 trillion. Now, he says we can reform it, but he doesn't say how.
Yeah, he tells us that he's got several different possibilities, but then you finally track down what they are, and none of them are politically plausible. I mean, really, if there were a painless way out of this or a politically feasible way out of it, it would have already been implemented. I mean, that's basically, and like anytime somebody comes along and assures you there's some simple way out of this, you know it's not true because they would have done it already if that were the case. But you're right, this is the elephant in the living room. And in fact, although a lot of attention has been focused on Social Security, it's actually overwhelmingly Medicare. Of that $100+ trillion figure that you mentioned, overwhelmingly, I mean, 80% of that is Medicare. And of course, the part of the problem here is that we've got an aging population. I mean, a rapidly aging population. We've got a situation in which, in our lifetimes, we're going to see the number of people in this country aged 100 or over increasing by 13 times. Now, that's not, I say this, Jim, not because I'm sorry that people are living longer lives. That's a wonderful thing. You know, we should be delighted with a development like that. But the problem is no one has made provision for it. And, of course, people of that age absorb far more resources in terms of medical care than people who are younger do. And there's no provision for this. There's no provision has been made. In fact, when Pete Peterson, who's done a lot of good work on the entitlement programs, when he went to Western Europe and met with a lot of finance ministers there, they told him privately that, of course, they're not stupid. They know that the demographic crisis that's actually hitting Western Europe harder than it'll hit the U.S., partly because of our immigration, they know that these welfare state programs are going to be swept away. They can't possibly make good on all these promises. They realize that. But don't worry, they're going to be long retired by the time the crisis hits. Not their problem. And so it just goes to show what a myth it is that we've been fed, that supposedly the private sector is very short-term oriented. It thinks only about short-term profits, whereas the public sector, well, here we have our far-seeing public servants who think in terms of long time horizons. To the contrary, it's precisely because they don't have a long time horizon that we're in this situation in the first place.
I want to move on to the numbers that we look at the federal level are staggering in themselves, but there's even bigger problems developing at the state and the municipality level. You talk about, for example, just to show how this doesn't work, one of the worst run big cities in the U.S. is in my own state of California, which is San Francisco. Despite spending just millions and millions of dollars on homelessness, the homelessness problem is worse than any other comparable city. It's not only poorly managed, but let's talk about some of the things that we're seeing right now in Wisconsin, Indiana. It's almost like these people are out of touch. Somehow we can wave some magic wand, and these people are going to have salaries and pensions that are higher than any place else. Do you think, Tom, eventually we have that Greek moment where the markets say no more?
I think that's essentially inevitable. I mean, I certainly hope we don't have the Greek moment with regard to the rioting, because that was just, I mean, talk about having no dignity whatsoever. I mean, these are people who would, and I know people who live in Greece and who are all too aware of the political culture there, of people's expectations that if I can't retire at age 50, I got to go burn down a building. I mean, good grief. I hope we have more dignity than that in this country. But indeed, I mean, what's basically the way that state governments have dealt with public sector unions is they've had to walk a tightrope for a number of years, because on the one hand, the unions demand higher and higher wages, and they can't higher salaries, and they can't give them super duper high wages or salaries, because then they're in danger of getting ousted from office. But at the same time, they can't ignore these wage and salary demands entirely. Then they lose the support of the union. So what they've done is they've given them just modest enough wage and salary increases to keep them happy. But really what they've done is they've backloaded the promises by saying, well, here's what we'll really do. We'll give you these really generous pension programs. And given that the pension program, of course, isn't going to come due until, 10, 20, 30 years down the line, it's an easy way for politicians to, in the present, and the payout will come long after the politicians involved are retired. It was a clever scheme. But like many clever schemes, the giant footnote that no one paid attention to is now coming to the fore. And we're seeing now, I was just in Ohio the other day, and apparently there's going to be a similar sort of showdown there, not just with the teachers, but also with police and fire. I mean, we've seen in New York, they've got countless people retiring with six-figure tax-free pensions. It's astonishing. At some point, in fact, last year it got so bad that the governor of New York even considered a proposal. My friend Harry Wilson was actually running for comptroller of New York, and he almost won. He was first time ever running for political office. He got 48% against an incumbent. It was very, very close. And one of the issues he was running on was that the governor was considering a proposal to bail out the New York pension fund by borrowing from the New York pension fund. I mean, Jim, it just doesn't get any more insane than that. And so, of course, at some point, the house of cards comes down. Nobody can know exactly when that moment is, but I certainly wouldn't want to be invested in municipal bonds or anything like that at a time like this.
I want to move on to what we're doing with the economy, and especially after the credit crisis. And I want to move on to these gargantuan deficits that we have coming from Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. And then on top of that, in 2010, we pass an additional entitlement with Obamacare. I mean, the system's broke as it is. And it's like somebody that has run their credit cards up to the hilt is facing bankruptcy and then is suddenly granted a new credit card to go out and spend even more. This is insane.
It absolutely is. And so in probably one of the tamest of my chapters, I do talk about Obamacare. Basically, it's Obamacare for people like me who are not that interested in the details of healthcare. Just tell me what's wrong with this thing. Why should we not have done it? What would be a better alternative? But one thing that's interesting about this is that one of the architects of the Obama plan, I would say a few weeks ago even, just openly admitted that this is not a cost-cutting plan. This is a coverage plan. The cost-cutting, which we were promised, well, that'll come down the road, but we thought coverage was more important first. So we've been assured that really people like you and me were worried about nothing, because don't worry, Obamacare is going to do the cost containment for us, and so a lot of these nightmare scenarios aren't going to occur. But to the contrary, it does nothing. What? Explain to me what exactly this thing does to contain costs. It aggravates every existing trend that has led to higher costs. And I can think of maybe half a dozen ways that it does that. And this just sort of brings to mind, I have heard through the grapevine that one of the things that Congressman Ron Paul is toying with if he were to run for president, now I don't have any direct line on this, but I've heard indirectly, is this possibility, basically saying to young people who are obviously going to get the short end of this stick, that's obvious, but really to anybody in the country, he's toying with this, saying, what would you say if we offered you this deal? You can be taxed 10%, we'll tax you 10% at that rate, and in return for getting that kind of tax rate, you get to opt out of the system. You don't get any of the so-called benefits, but all you ever have to pay is 10%. Would you take that deal? I mean, I think there would be people would be stepping over their own grandmothers to grab at that deal. So I think that's a sort of situation, the kind of thinking we need to have, because just let's see if we can trim $61 billion off the federal budget. As I've said before, that's like taking 10 cents off a trip to the moon. I mean, we need to think way, way outside the box, and the box is this very, very constrained political discourse we're allowed to have, where all your opinions have to fall somewhere between Joe Biden and Mitt Romney for you to be considered respectable. Well, you know what? The answers to our problems are not going to be found inside that box. That's the source of our problems. That box needs to be crushed into the ground and set on fire, and that's more or less what I've committed myself to.
Well, it's amazing because, you know, one of the things that always disturbs me, Tom, is whenever they talk about, and you see this in the media with the Sunday talk shows, that somehow there's some new tax that could pay for all this, or the one, my favorite, is the Social Security Trust Fund is sound. I mean, I looked at last year's financial statement for the government, and as you know, Tom, the government has been running these huge surpluses in Social Security. They spend the money and issue an IOU. Well, that trust fund, you know, when I think of a trust fund, I think of, you know, like a pension account where money's been set aside. It's invested in stocks and bonds and some kind of asset that will be there to make payments when people need them, as most corporate pension plans are. But the government has no trust fund. It's basically a little file drawer someplace in Virginia. And nobody talks about that. And they talk about, oh, we can't cut this, we can't cut that. And they act like there's this somehow untapped resource that we have in this country that can pay for all this largesse.
Well, Jim, not too long ago, Peter Schiff had on his program a former Social Security actuary. And Schiff just came out and said, do you know what a Ponzi scheme is? And the guy said, well, yeah, of course. And Schiff said, what's the difference between Social Security and a Ponzi scheme? And Jim, I kid you not, the line went dead silence. And, of course, on radio, dead silence is murder. I mean, you've got to fill that silence. So Schiff said, look, you know what? I'll give you the whole break to think over your answer. So they went to a commercial break. They come back. The guy still has no answer. Well, it's not like he was asking some critic of Social Security. He's talking to one of the guys who's involved in it. And, of course, this Social Security Trust Fund, I mean, they must think we are seriously a bunch of stupid rubes to still be pulling this Social Security Trust Fund. You're right. Any year there's a surplus of income over outlays with Social Security. Yeah, there's a surplus, so you think, oh, that surplus probably goes in the trust fund. No, the surplus, as you say, is blown immediately on other things. And IOUs in that amount are thrown into the trust fund. And they say, look, we have assets in the trust fund. We get all these IOUs. Yeah, how do they cash in the IOUs? By taxing the public. But they already taxed the public for Social Security, and then they blew the money. So now we're being taxed a second time for the same thing. Could you imagine a private firm pulling something like this, and then every once in a while redefining the terms of the program and redefining the age at which you can receive and the amount you'll receive and threatening to take all of your money that you were expecting if you happen to earn more than a certain amount? I mean, no one would be able to get away with that, whereas here, when it comes to the government, well, we just consider this to be public policy, and that's just the way it is. It's unbelievable, the double standard, whereby we will look the other way at the most unbelievable outrages perpetrated in the public sector, whereas the private sector is constantly slammed and denounced as the den of exploiters and so on and on, people who care nothing for the common good. It is exactly the opposite as far as I can see.
I want to move on to, once again, something we discussed earlier. And anytime there's an economic crisis, there's cries from, the Paul Krugmans in the world and politicians. The government needs to do something about it. And when we take a look at, even the New York Times talked about when the stimulus package was put together, it was drafted by inside corporations, so it would favor money distributed to themselves. And much of the debate over the stimulus turned, unfortunately, in terms of how much pork. The problem was, with the fiscal stimulus, it's really tooth fairy economics. As many economists know, much of the recovery came from an inventory rebuild. And what jobs, the only jobs that were created were government jobs. And yet you have talk right now about, there's even talk what happens in June when the Fed's QE2 ends. There's even talk about maybe a new spending program. And let's talk about, Tom, in this TARP money that the public saw and bailing out a lot of these banks and corporations. Okay, a lot of those banks have paid back some of the money. What happened? Was that money used by the government to pay down its debt? No, they spent it.
Well, all of this combined, I mean, it's like if you were to try to devise a plan that would consist of all the wrong things, I couldn't possibly improve on what they've done. And in the short run, you know, they've put some Band-Aids and Scotch tape on this crumbling building and saying, you know, hey, look, the thing's still standing. I'd like to know what's in Ben Bernanke's personal portfolio. Is there any way to find that out? I'd love to know, or if anybody on CNBC who tells me I don't need to be in precious metals, that's just a lot of scare talk. How many of them are in precious metal? I mean, I just like to know. But yeah, when we look at all this, we look at TARP and we're told that this was all wonderful and the taxpayers made money. Well, on net, they didn't make money. On net, when you include all the TARP spending, it still was a loss. But also, this is all a good thing only if you think preserving Wall Street as we knew it was an end in itself, whereas I don't think that was a good thing. I don't think it should be preserved as we knew it. I think it should be forced to restructure. And then in terms of the stimulus package, well, you're right, it's not the pork, and of course you can find ridiculous spending programs in the stimulus. Everybody knows that. But the key objection to the stimulus is partly that, of course, the resources devoted to the stimulus have to come from somewhere. So instead of being directed to genuine consumer demand, they're redeployed in these arbitrary projects. And also that the stimulus spending is totally irrelevant to the problem. The problem is that, as the Austrians would say, is that during the boom, we had artificially low interest rates. And the significance of that is that when interest rates are pushed down, it's not that more investment takes place, it's that different kinds of investment take place than would otherwise take place. Investment that is more sensitive to interest rates. So, you know, if it's some project whereby, you know, I may not see a profit for 5 years and I'm going to have to borrow for 5 years, that type of project, like building a new apartment complex or something, and I have to wait for years and years of getting rental payments to recoup my initial outlay, that's interest rate sensitive. Whereas, you know, some farmer buying a new shovel is not interest rate sensitive. So in other words, there are different types of investment that are undertaken than the free market would want to be undertaken. And this disrupts the natural structure of production, so that eventually the economy realizes that it's producing all the wrong kind of things in the wrong combinations and the wrong amounts at the wrong time, and then we get the crash. Well, how does stimulus spending get us out of this? It just blows a lot of arbitrary money. We don't need more arbitrary money blown. We need the free market unhampered to use the price system to reallocate resources out of bubble sectors and into previously starved sectors. And we can't know what those are because we're not central planners. Only entrepreneurs acting in response to what they're seeing in the price system, only they can make these decisions. So in other words, it's not that we're saying we should do nothing. Government should do nothing, but we should do something. Entrepreneurs, private property owners, risking their own capital, they should do something. They should be allowed to do something without constantly being hampered and getting all these false signals and getting bubble sectors propped up and tax credits to keep expanding the bubble sector. No, that is taking wealth away from where it belongs and propping up artificial, phony baloney wealth that never really existed in the first place.
You know, one area when you talk about artificial wealth, as we saw in the bailout, we got this saying it was too big to fail. We couldn't let Bear Stearns and AIG and General Motors go under because they were too big. If you take a look at it as the consequence, it creates a different kind of business model in the economy, because when you have a financial institution that is so large it's deemed too big to fail, it stands, Tom, to gain an artificial advantage at the expense of its competitors, because smaller competitors are allowed to fail. lenders know that these big, large firms, and I would say that as a result of the financial crisis, these too big to fail firms have gotten even bigger. JP Morgan is a much bigger bank today with a lot more risk exposure. So is Bank of America. So is Wells Fargo. And look at Freddie and Fannie. You couldn't touch them in the 80s, but look how much they're hemorrhaging every month. They're still losing billions of dollars.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of stuff in Rollback about the too big to fail thing. And, of course, one of the ways that a too big to fail institution gets an artificial advantage is that it can borrow more cheaply because it has this, you might call it a negative risk premium built in. People have this kind of assurance, and as we've seen, it's indeed a well-founded assurance, that their money will be perfectly safe and don't worry about it because this is a too big to fail institution, whereas the smaller institutions have a genuine risk premium built in. And, this is an industry in which just the tiniest difference in interest rates which they can borrow means everything, means in terms of profits and so forth. This goes beyond just the financial sector and Fannie and Freddie. I mean, we see this also. I remember when I was a kid, if anybody would say that we need to look at the military budget, I would have said, what are you, some kind of commie? I mean, of course, nothing wrong with the military budget, perfectly fine. Well, there we also see the too big to fail phenomenon. We have this very cozy relationship between certain military firms and the government, such that we've seen implicit bailouts of these firms. Like when Lockheed was in trouble, it got the contract for the Trident missile, or when Boeing was in trouble, it got a bizarre contract to lease 767 passenger jets to the military at a time when the military was actually saying we don't need these jets, these are not appropriate for what we need, and it would actually be cheaper for us to buy them outright than to lease them from Boeing. The leasing agreement went through anyway to prop up Boeing when it was in trouble. I mean, this is just, it permeates the whole system, and meanwhile, the brain-dead left clings to the idea that the federal government is a wonderful progressive institution looking out for the little guy. How deluded would you have to be to draw that conclusion?
I don't know, but, here's another one, too. It's not just the bailouts that we've seen, the huge, massive, and I mean massive deficits. I never would have thought in my career when I started in this business 30 years ago, we would be sitting here having a conversation about a $1.7 trillion deficit. That kind of number was just unimaginable.
Yeah.
But let's talk about also the financial reform bill, all these regulators. Now, I recently interviewed an individual that played an advisory role to the movie Inside Job, which got the Academy Award. And I thought the director and the writers of the film did a good job in explaining the incestuousness between regulators, academics, Wall Street. But it really, I guess maybe what really struck me about this whole thing is how the regulators were asleep at the wheel. They didn't do their jobs. What good is it to pass more laws, more regulations, if those who charged with enforcing them don't do so? Because, I mean, look at the SEC when they were given evidence on Bernie Madoff.
Yeah. They're too busy watching computer porn to do anything about it.
Yeah.
I mean, that was seriously true, that was a big problem at the SEC, is they're doing that instead. The financial reform bill, it's one of these things where everybody knows that we're going to have to just wait to see what it really means. I mean, this really is a Nancy Pelosi, you got to pass the bill so you can find out what's in it kind of situation. Because when you look at the text of it, there are over 100 uses of the phrase, the committee shall decide, the committee shall determine, and gee, who do you think is going to get to have committee? I mean, is it going to be Joe Blow at local community bank? Is it going to be some guy with a little a retail toy store? Who do you think is going to get these meetings? So of course, it'll just be another attempt to game the system as before. And then, Kotlikoff, whom you mentioned earlier, he's identified 115 distinct regulatory bodies for the financial sector. And in doing so, he was implicitly saying, you'll forgive me if I'm skeptical of the idea that if only we had 116, then we wouldn't have had this problem. Look, first of all, the whole system is screwed up from the Federal Reserve on down. It gives exactly the wrong incentives to every major player. That's a fact, and that plays no role in the financial reform. But secondly, let's consider that the regulators that, who are supposed to keep us all safe, we attribute to these people superhuman qualities that usually they don't really deserve. I mean, these are usually just time-serving drones. Let's face it, these are not separate race of supermen. The regulators basically didn't see anything wrong, and they said that repeatedly. I mean, even the Federal Reserve chairman at the time, Greenspan and Bernanke, were telling us all wonderful things about lending standards in the housing market. So just giving us a whole bunch more of these or one giant one of these, that can't fix an inherently corrupt system. And beyond that, what would really be nice is if you do have wayward bank management, well, who should be disciplining them? People who have a financial stake in the outcome. Regulators have no financial stake in the outcome whatsoever. They're going to get their check at the end of the day no matter what happens. But institutional investors, that whether it's pension funds or insurance companies or whatever, that might be able to keep an eye on what's going on, are forbidden by law from holding more than a tiny, tiny stake in any particular financial institution. So therefore, the natural watchdog function of these people is artificially diminished by these sorts of interventions. I would much more trust somebody with his own bucks on the line than I would, Joe Blow regulator, because most of these regulators, let's face it, these are not the kids who graduated number 1 from Harvard Business School. These are the people who graduated number 512 from Podunk Business School. I'm pretty sure that the bright businessmen are going to run rings around these people regardless of what happens. I don't trust them to keep the system sound. I want a total reform of the monetary system, and I want a much diminished or eliminated Fed, and then we might have some chance of a system that actually works instead of trying to constantly add more Scotch tape to a house of cards.
I want to move on to the elephant in the room. And so much of my business, Tom, is focused on every single little nuance or pronouncement by the, Fed officials. And the Fed is expanding its balance sheet. And there's already talk that, QE2 will come to an end. I just don't see that happening when the government is running a budget deficit of about $130 billion a month. Plus, we have almost more than $200 billion a month of short-term debt coming due. That's almost $350 billion a month that the United States has to refinance or finance the new debt. And look what has happened to our saving system. Imagine if you were saving, you spent 30 years of your working career or 40 years, you put aside some money and you thought, okay, I'm looking forward to retirement. Look at the rate of return that you're getting on those savings today, and then look at the purchasing power. But one more comment is Bernanke has gone before Capitol Hill last week, and he's gone before in the various speeches he's made in the last couple of weeks, where he said, look at this QE thing I've done. It's wonderful. Look at stock prices since we put QE2 into effect. The stock market is up, but then he refuses to take any blame for the rise in commodity prices, the rise in food prices, the rise in cost structures that we're seeing as a result of inflation heating up. Let's talk about the Federal Reserve and its role that it has played in these crises.
Well, this is another example of, I think it's the classic example of the propaganda version of history as opposed to the real one. And so that's why I've got a whole chapter on this, because a lot of Americans feel like, first of all, I'm never even going to understand what the Fed is or does. It all sounds much too complicated to me. I'm probably not even entitled to an opinion on it. And that's, if I were running something like the Fed, that's exactly what I would want the general public to think. And so, but when you actually look at the Fed's mandate that it's had for a number of decades, it's got to keep price inflation low and output and employment high. Well, okay, has it succeeded or not? Well, we're told repeatedly that, good heavens, what kind of a Neanderthal would you have to be not to recognize that things have been much improved since we had the Fed? We've had fewer recessions, and they have been shorter and shallower, and so on and on. Well, actually, that's not true, believe it or not. I realize that this will meet some resistance, but I've got all the statistics in the Fed chapter. And the key thing is that up until relatively recently, we've been relying on statistics from before the Fed that turn out to be unreliable. And in fact, even Christina Romer, who was a chief economist under Obama, so is by no means a, Ron Paul and the Fed type. She wrote a couple of very important academic papers that others have followed up on, basically saying that the numbers are so unreliable from the time around the creation of the Fed and beforehand that, you might as well be using tea leaves to figure out what's going on as opposed to these numbers. They overstate the volatility before the Fed and understate the volatility after it, and that when we correct for these errors, it is by no means a foregone conclusion that the Fed has been a net benefit in terms of the number of recessions, the depth and length of these recessions, and so on and so forth. And then there's just a common sense fact that before you had the Fed, if you wanted to save for the future, sure, you could invest your money and see if you could get a nice return from it, but you always had the more conservative option to you of just hanging on to your precious metal coins. And over time, the precious metal coins would gain in purchasing power, which they indeed did in peacetime throughout the 19th century. Whereas today, if you want to save for the future, well, gee, good luck. Where are you going to get a decent return? What's the guy who's telling you always to get out of debt? He's got his own show on Fox Business.
Dave Ramsey.
And he was always saying, put all your money in a mutual fund, because then you'll get like a 10% return. Where's that happening? There is no such outlet. You'd have to be some genius to do it. So we've got that problem. But secondly, can you just hold on to your money the way you used to be able to and at least maintain and maybe gain some purchasing power? Of course not. It would be the worst strategy you could follow. You'd lose about a third of your purchasing power in no time at all. So it makes everybody extremely vulnerable. Everybody has got to become a financial speculator going into financial markets where they have no business being in the first place just to hang on to the purchasing power of their nest egg. How is this? This is how the average person is affected by the Fed. How is this an unambiguous improvement?
It isn't. The thing about this is there is no such thing as free lunch, despite Ben Bernanke's speech in 2002 where he said this government has this wonderful invention called the printing press, which basically cost the government nothing. It's always deflected, and this is something that I think our media and the government, and maybe it's a result of our education system, Tom, that nobody ever questions. Like when Bernanke gets up there and somebody says something about inflation, he puts out this silly thing and nonsense that, core inflation is a little over 1%. I think one senator last week finally said, look, I think he was from New Mexico. There were more people believed in aliens than believed that inflation was running at 1%. But let's bring this to a head, because we've got workers in Wisconsin that want more pay and benefits. They don't want to give up. And this is playing off across several states in the Midwest. We have voters wanting more Social Security benefits, Washington wanting to spend more money, and we're sitting here and arguing over whether we're going to cut spending by $4 billion and $6 billion. Tom, if we do not take any steps, and the kind of steps that you're talking about, I almost would give the example, it's like you just went to your doctor. You weigh 350 pounds, your cholesterol's 350, your arteries are clogged, and your doctor is saying, look, you need to go on a diet, you need to cut, you need to start exercising gradually, or you're going to die of a heart attack. The kind of things that you're talking about, given the size of government, you're talking about some dramatic cuts. In one of your chapters, you're talking about we as Americans are going to see something that we have never seen probably in our nation's history. The kind of cuts that you're talking about that will be either taken voluntarily or be forced upon us.
And every year that the entitlement problem is not addressed, we add to that problem a figure somewhere between $2 and $4 trillion every single year. So when the president says, well, now's not the time to make any real changes, we have to just stand pat, it would be irresponsible to make dramatic changes right now. No, what's irresponsible is not to make them, because then when the collapse comes, it's all the worse, because then it's been underfunded all the worse all those years. And people continue because, again, of that naive view they got in the sixth grade that the experts are in charge and they're pursuing what's best for you, and just sit back and trust them and spend your time at the mall or watching football and getting drunk, because don't worry, the wise paternal custodianship of Joe Biden will not let you down. This is going to leave people into the belief, coupled with the belief in the trust fund, that, it's not so urgent for me to save for the future because there's a trust fund, there's my wise overlords in Washington, it's all going to come out all right. So it's interesting to me that when Rand Paul proposed a plan for cutting the budget by $500 billion in 1 year, which is not even 1/3 of the problem, given, as you mentioned, a nearly $1.7 trillion deficit. They were practically reaching for cut his head off, or they just ignored him. And so he wrote in the Wall Street Journal, he said, look, if anybody's got a better proposal, or you've got other things that you would cut apart from the things I'm proposing, I'd love to hear it. And the response, of course, was crickets, no response at all. But this is, at least he's sort of coming to terms with the problem, and yet this is the one person who is most demonized, most ignored, most spat upon. Well, that, I think, tells you what's going on in our society. You've got two false choices here. Either we continue on the current path, or we make cuts that are so trivial that they're not even worth the time we're taking to debate them. Well, if that's the path we want to stay on, then we are inevitably headed for default, and we're headed for a situation in which these types of changes will have to be made very quickly in a time of great social upheaval, and we will say to ourselves, if only we could have made these changes back when we could have done them in times of tranquility, and when we could have done them as sober adults. Shame on us for missing that opportunity.
Tom, how do you think this gets resolved? Because it doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats. I mean, you've got Republicans talking about $60 billion in cuts in a year where the budget deficit's going to be $1.7 trillion. The national debt is growing by leaps and bounds, and at some point, interest is going to consume almost 40% of government revenues, gross revenues. So sooner or later, we will either hyperinflate our way or we're going to default. But in your opinion, how does this thing get resolved? Because there doesn't appear to be any awareness or suggestions coming from the media. They're basically like lapdogs at press conferences.
Yeah.
You're not seeing it come from Wall Street, who loves the party time that stocks are going up. So how does this get resolved?
Well, Jim, I'd love it to be resolved by people coming to their senses and saying, look, we're going to go through some very difficult years for a while, but it's unavoidable. And on the other side of this, we will emerge with a more robust economy. We'll be able to rebuild. We'll start from ground zero and go from there. But I think what's more likely, the subtitle of my book, which is kind of clumsy, but the subtitle of Rollback is Repealing Big Government Before the Coming Fiscal Collapse. I think what's more likely, frankly, is that we'll repeal big government through the coming fiscal collapse, that the major changes won't actually be made until they are really forced upon us, until we're just faced with them, till the crisis hits where suddenly, and it could be at any time, it could be in just one bad headline, whatever it is that makes lenders to the U.S. antsy or demand a higher interest return, whatever it is, that could happen very suddenly, and then the crisis hits, and the temptation will be just to try to print our way out of it. The Fed could well at that point say to the Treasury, look, you guys, you're on your own. I mean, we've been pretty accommodating up to this point, but we are not going to go down in history as the institution that completely wrecked the dollar. I mean, we almost wrecked the whole thing, but we're not going down that route, and we all know our pensions are denominated in dollars, so we're not doing that. And you could see all kinds of things happen in a crisis. You could see Congress try to nationalize the Fed and get that printing press from them and just start printing the money. That's possible. It's more possible that they would do that, I think, than that the Fed would just go along with hyperinflation. But regardless, the possibilities are all pretty grim. And as I say, they would demand very dramatic changes in a very short amount of time. And when I say repealing big government through the collapse, what I mean is that when it comes down to a question of either we unplug your granny or we abolish the Department of Education, I think I know how most people are going to come down on this. I'm pretty sure local parents can probably run their own schools without paying taxes for the privilege of being bossed around by their betters. I'm pretty sure we'd get by just fine without that. I think we had some education in this country before 1979 when we got that department. I think we'll be okay. I think that's when we'll see the big changes, and probably not before. I'm doing my best with Rollback and my public speaking, whatever, to try to resolve this as quickly as possible so that so that this slow motion train wreck can be stopped. But I don't know if it's possible.
I would say that it seems like it's going to take a series of crises. I mean, things went on as usual in Greece until they got to the point where nobody would loan them money anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're seeing this at the state level in the city level. Of course, here in California, we've already had a couple cities default on their debt. And once you start defaulting on your debt, it's more difficult to tap the markets. Eventually, you may get a temporary reprieve by default, but then good luck trying to raise money because nobody trusts you. Seems like, Tom, eventually we're going to have to do this, but it seems like it's going to have to be forced upon us.
It's a shame, again, because I remember years ago before I had children, and people would say, oh, gosh, what we're doing to our children. And I'd say, yeah, this is all kind of cloying and sentimental. But, now I've got 4 little girls, and I think, my gosh, I think back to the years when I grew up. I was a kid in the 80s, and I was in college in the early 90s, and, I got out of college, and there were just jobs everywhere. Everything was great and booming, and it just seemed almost like this was the natural order of things. And, of course, it is the natural order of things when you have a normal economy. And at that time, we still had, I think we've had a lot of Fed distortion of the economy. We've had a lot of prosperity that's been not really genuine prosperity. But the point was that we at least had optimism at that time. And it just seemed like whatever my criticisms of the way the economy is being run, at least it's delivering the goods and somehow it's all working out. And my kids are not growing up in that environment at all. Right now, a recent poll of college seniors finds 85% of them intending to move back in with their parents when they graduate. They don't know what to do. They've got no prospects. And meanwhile, it's on their shoulders that these rickety entitlement programs are resting, so that if they do manage to find a job in this impossible, distorted economy, then they're going to carry on their shoulders this impossible burden. And as they're carrying it and working harder and harder and longer just to stand still, they're going to find that to add insult to injury, the programs are just going to collapse anyway. It is an absolute outrage what's being done to the younger people, but most of them, unfortunately, are so out to lunch that they're being exploited and they don't even know it. Look, if you don't care that you're being treated this way, I guess, I don't know, why should I care if they themselves don't? But there are enough young people who are so frustrated that if they were given that chance, would you opt out of the system? In exchange for just 10%, would you opt out of the system? Man, they would grab for that much faster than I think they would grab for any of the phony baloney bumper sticker slogans we're going to hear from any other presidential candidate.
I think it's eventually going to get to that because, politicians, as you know, will scramble to keep anything going. They'll kick the can down the road, and I suspect we are going to see QE3. Maybe we'll have to go through some gyrations in the market, but next year's a presidential election year, and Tom, who's going to want to get on the stump, whether you're running for president, senator, or the House of Representatives? Hi, if you elect me, I'm going to cut your benefits, I'm going to raise taxes, or I'm going to do something like that. That's not the message you hear from, your politician during an election year. They're usually handing out lollipops. That's
true, but this year what will be interesting is if Ron Paul runs and then also Governor Gary Johnson runs. And Gary Johnson is basically calling for cutting $1 trillion and a half this year. He's coming right out and saying it. He's a wealthy man. He doesn't care if he wins or not. He wants to be the guy who is the first one or one of the first ones to start saying these things so that it won't seem so alarming or unusual to hear them in the future. So that's at least some cause for optimism.
Well, hopefully we can avoid it, but sometimes it's hard to be optimistic when you see the evening news, you read the press, and nobody's acknowledging these problems or even trying to address them in a truthful manner. The name of the book is called Rollback, Repealing Big Government Before the Coming Fiscal Collapse. It's written by Thomas E. Woods, Jr. Tom's been my guest, and Tom, thanks for coming on the program. All the best to you with this book, and hopefully we can get enough American people to start reading it and understand the challenges we face in the next decade.
Thanks, Jim. And in fact, they can read Chapter 1 for free. If they go to tomwoods.com, they can read that, and that's the most important one. So tomwoods.com, read that for free, and I'll never bother you again, I promise.
All right. Tom, all the best to you, sir.
Thanks a million, Jim. Appreciate it.
All right, folks, that's our episode for today. If you don't yet have my 5 Paths to an Online Income ebook, man, you are shooting yourself in the foot. That is one darn good ebook, written from scratch, no recycled material in there. Everything I've done myself, self-publishing a book, running a podcast, and 3 other things. You're just going to have to get the darn book to find out what they are. And these are things that you can do because you love doing them, and you can do them because they actually can bring in a little dough and put some food on your table. So how do you do it? I got the whole strategy. I got the tech side. I got everything handled step by step in that free ebook over at pathstoincome.com, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Is that what you have to say, Sarah? All right. Well, that's Sarah talking to everybody. Say goodbye.
Bye.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.